We're going to be talking today about financing Asia's energy transition to reach key goals in a region heavily impacted by climate change. Asia must harness the power of finance to enable and also accelerate the transition to a lower carbon economy. And regional and global institutions, they're going to play an important role in funding this transition while balancing the growing energy security challenges, which are very apparent here, especially after last year. I want to start it off, I want to talk about the Just Energy Transition Partnership. I've got a question for you, Jackie. So JETP, it's a partnership for wealthier nations to fund coal-dependent developing nations. It's billed as an innovative approach to international cooperation to accelerate country-led energy transition. There have been 2 partnerships done here in Asia, Vietnam, and in Indonesia. And I was wondering if you could just provide any update on what's happening there.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And it's great. Thank you, Bloomberg, for inviting the Asian Development Bank. So JETP, as it's called, or a subset of that is what we call the energy transition mechanisms, which is all about phasing out coal-fired power plants here in this region. I mean, just a couple of simple facts. 50% of the world's carbon emissions come from Asia. The issue is that a lot of the coal-fired power plants in this region, as you would expect, are what I call very young plants. They got another 20 to 30 years still to go. So, what do you do about this? So, I really think, I always say this, it's the solution is not with the ADBs, the solution is with all of us in this room and many more working together. So this whole JETP is to make sure that when you phase out these coal-fired power plants, you make sure that nobody is unduly impacted. I'll give you a very simple example. If you close a power plant in Indonesia, there may be a bus driver who's passing that coal-fired power plant every day. Well, suddenly if there's no coal-fired power plant there, has he lost his job? And that's where an entity like the ADB thinks about all the social and environmental impacts of closing down a power plant and making sure that the social and economic impacts is well taken care of. So we're starting this in Indonesia. It's quite, again, one of the other facts that many people don't know. If you look at a country like Indonesia, it has abundant coal reserves, but the island of Java has an oversupply of power. So how can you encourage a country like Indonesia to go and do renewable energy? And the only way you can do that is first persuade them to reduce the asset life of coal-fired power plants, and then you can encourage them to do renewable energy. So I'm very excited about the whole just energy transition. I'm very excited about the work we're doing on the energy transition mechanism. First, hopefully on a pilot project called Cirebon to reduce the asset life of that plant, and then hopefully replicating that in Vietnam and elsewhere. I'll stop there.
Jackie, I've actually got a small follow-up question on that. So
sure.
I'm just going to stick with you for one more minute. Can you just walk through a little bit more? Reducing coal rather than, why do that rather than purely focusing on just pushing renewables? I do understand what you said that something about how, once you reduce the coal, then you can bring the renewables out. But if you focus on investing in the renewables and building out the renewables, won't that inevitably, eat into coal and reduce the coal dependence?
I mean, it's a good question, but again, the issue still with renewable energy, it's intermittent power, right? So it's not 24/7. You've got to look at what's happened here in Singapore the last couple of weeks. It's been raining like crazy, so you can't rely just on solar, right? So renewable energy is intermittent. You've got to make sure that there's sufficient base load. And again, the whole issue with renewable energy is to develop battery storage. Battery storage at the moment is very expensive. So until that technology is developed, you can't just persuade governments to just close coal-fired power plants, which are what's called baseload power, tomorrow. It's got to be done gradually. And so that's why I really think that trying to persuade state-owned utilities and private sector companies to gradually reduce the asset lives of coal-fired power plants and then during that time, develop renewable energy, develop battery storage, such that eventually we can have a higher percentage of renewable energy in some of these Southeast Asian countries. That's the way to go.
Thanks, Jackie. I appreciate it. Now, I want to just jump to Sylvia at Amundi. I guess, can you just talk a little bit about how private sector can hold companies accountable with ESG targets, and if you can share any personal experiences or experiences within your organization?
Sure, thanks, Stephen. Actually, for the Amundi, as a responsible investor, we have several tools that we can actually nudge the companies a little bit to improve better on the path of the energy transition. It's really central to net zero commitments. So how do we do it? Usually as part of the ESG integrations within our ESG methodology, which is a score, we can actually selectively adjust their energy score to even exclusion, meaning an active portfolio manager wouldn't be able to invest in the name. The other way is also engagements. You've probably heard a lot about stewardship, focus about engagements and votings. That is still central to what we do. So for engagement for last year, we have engaged for over 2,000 companies in a year, and that's worldwide, and voted more than 10,000 at the AGM. So that's really the power that we do in terms of what are we telling the company, especially the board of directors, what they should be doing in terms of the climate, in terms of the whole ESG angles. I guess the other way is when we monitor the companies in terms of the energy transition progress, and we feel that they're not doing a good job, we will actually identify them as a type of laggard in terms of energy transition. And what do we do in terms of, on the severity of the laggard? Then we'll possibly vote against one of the directors, a few, or even across the whole board. So that's actually the power that we're speaking up in terms of telling the director they need to do better.
I know you're very active in Europe. Have you had any successes, or how's the experience been in Asia, and how's it been different in Asia than in other parts of the world?
Yeah, we have actually. So last year we did file the first climate shareholder resolution in Japan. It's for utility companies, and we have engaging with them for the past few years. They do have very fancy, decarbonization plan, net zero, everything. But the thing is, we feel that it's not enough. The devil is really in the details. So what is it we're asking the company to do is to focus a lot more on that detailed action plan, and that to be science-based, which is Paris Agreement aligned. The other thing is to really look at in terms of that linkage to the remunerations to the directors. So that is what we're pushing for. And actually with that shareholder resolutions, we actually wanted the word on environmental finance being really the best engagement initiative of the year for 2022. So very, very glad about the award, and also really showcase what is it that we're doing in this space, being active shareholders.
Thank you. Now I'll move to Burak, and who's with the investment office in Turkey. I'm quite curious about how developing nations and how other countries have to sort of look at and take Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM. And I was wondering, because of Turkey's, in Asia it's going to be something that is talked about from Vietnam and other exporters, something that they have to care about. But because Turkey is so close geographically to where a lot of these countries will be importing from, what is Turkey doing, and how is it something that companies and the government are looking at?
So yeah, you described the outlook for Turkey. The renewable energy story of Turkey started in 2005. So we have been adjusting our economy accordingly. And we enacted a green energy law at that time. And since that time, since we provided a kind of solid legal basis and predictable, foreseeable projection for especially international investors, we were able to get some major investments from international companies and local companies. Just to give you an idea, currently our installed capacity for electricity generation is around 104 gigawatts, and out of that, 54% is from renewables. Back in 2005, these share of renewables were just around 33%. And we again said a few quarters ago, we released our strategy on renewable energy. By year 2035, we will have 65% of share of renewable in our generation capacity. So CBAM, which is called as a kind of a carbon tax on the border, it will happen soon. I mean, all the preparations are done. So the countries are getting prepared for that to keep their international competitiveness. So for us, we established a task force. Our Minister of Trade is leading it. Soon we will enact a climate law. It will be on the agenda of the Parliament in the next season by October. So we are expecting that with that law, we will enable an emission trading system within the country. Currently, we already have a free exchange market for the energy. And through that market, you can trade energy and you can certify that you are a green energy producer. I mean, you can get the IREC certificate. So we are getting prepared for that. And at the same time, our Minister of Industry is providing incentives for the industrial companies for their green transition, for their, lowering their carbon emissions. So it is an important agenda for us because more than half of the exports of Turkey is to European countries. So we are transforming our industry accordingly.
And sorry, I just want to pull up some data that I have here from Ember. It shows that Turkey's coal generation for the first half of the year was the highest since at least 2018. And I understand that obviously renewables are growing quite rapidly, but still, coal is needed to some degree in the country. How does the government and how do you, as looking for foreign direct investment to the country, how does that sort of set the policy and sector expectations going forward?
So, as you know, for the generation capacity from the renewables, it depends on the seasons and the years. For example, last year we generated 42% of our electricity from the renewables, but a few years ago it was more than 50%. So it is due to the seasonality, I think. So when it comes to the coal plant, currently we are not installing new capacity on the coal, and in the long run we will have a kind of phase-out plan. And definitely we are investing in the nuclear. Our first reactor will be ready by next year, 1.2 gigawatt of capacity, and we will have it in the next years. So base load is important, and we are working with both international and domestic investors to strengthen the base load. And in addition to that, the storage is important. Not only the battery storage, but also hydraulic. In our country, it is feasible to do hydraulic storage. So recently we issued licenses for the next 10 years. Again, we have issued licenses of up to 35 gigawatts of installed storage capacity. So it's a long-term plan for us.
Thank you. Jackie, I want to go back to you real quick. You mentioned very briefly the Pacific Islands, and I kind of want to go back to that real quick. How can this? I think that's a region that often financial institutions aren't always looking at. What can be done to focus more on that region, and what can institutions do to help with their decarbonization?
No, I mean I couldn't agree more, right? And particularly with climate change, some of these small islands are extremely vulnerable. But again, I do empathize with say commercial banks. Some of these islands are tiny, right? So, you look at even the second largest island in the Pacific is a country called Tonga. It's got a population of less than 1 million. There's cities in India and China that are towns in India and China that are bigger than that. So how do you persuade banks and even private sector sponsors to look at these Pacific Island countries? It's difficult, just from a scale perspective. Again, this is where I think a couple of things can be done, is from multilaterals like ourselves, that has to be our priority. It is the Asian Development Bank's priority, those 14 Pacific Island countries. From the private sector, we need to work with governments to promote private sector sponsorship. Maybe there's also a way to try and bring some of these Pacific Island countries together and say, why don't you do some kind of like a portfolio type of financing to try and create some scale. But the big challenge is just the populations in these countries. They are so important, and they are, you're 100% right, they're not recognized as much as they should be, but it's a matter of scale.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just jumping around on topics a little bit, but I want to go to Sylvia real quick to talk about technology. When you're looking at Asia, there are a lot of MOUs and agreements signed around carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, not just in countries like Japan, but also Malaysia, and India is pushing it forward quite a bit. Do you think that there's a risk if there is too much focus on these new technologies that aren't quite proven yet? And should the Asia and the region or the world be striking a better balance between the technologies of the future versus the technologies that we have right now?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I feel that in some places, the renewable energy challenges has been a little bit overstated, and then the feasibility of those more nascent technology has been pretty much sort of understated in a way that it's a lot of time when we look at, it's great to sign MOU, but that shouldn't be the priority. The priority should really focus on the known technology, which is renewable in many places. Look at Vietnam, they have done a great job, for the past few years, really ramp up that wing in terms of the energy power. Of course, for us, it's still required, but it's a minor sort of focus as part of 2050, if you look at the science. So I think we should really go back to the science, what's really needed down the road, sort of like natural gas. So natural gas is really, for us, when you look at 2050, should be all abated, and to the minimal amount, and really for hard-to-abate sectors. So it should be transitioned for the time being as compared to coal. But I mean, at the end of the day, it really needs to be phased out, or having that abatement technology or sort of together as part of the considerations.
Are there any countries or regions that are doing it correctly? Like doing this transition correctly in terms of their investment in the right technologies in getting away from fossil fuels? Or is it not just Asia? Everyone kind of needs to step up.
Yeah, I guess we would never tell until 2050 to really see what's really happening at that stage. Are we really within 1.5, or are we really blow out of the temperature at the time? But again, I see the focus still. We're still, as investors, a lot of collaborations. We're still pushing the companies together with the regulator to really focus that renewable sort of the power to really extract that to really the maximum. I think there's a lot of studies also done by Bloomberg saying that actually a lot of time that's possible. And also the cost in terms of comparing to fossil fuel is actually way more efficient. So maybe sometimes we see it could be the red tapes, or as some parts in terms of may need energy reform to a certain extent. But either way, that's why we're bringing a lot of in the regions the discussions with the energy utility company, and actually bring down the regulators or government agencies as well to really sit down and discuss.
Thank you. Burak, actually, that's a good segue, talking about natural gas for a second. I know that Turkey is looking for foreign direct investment to develop its natural gas assets, and for clearly energy security reasons, right? Because of the last year's energy crisis, also reducing dependence on coal. Gas can be used to that degree. But Turkey also has, I think, a target to hit net zero by 2053.
Yep.
So how do you balance that, the investment in the gas, with your net zero ambitions?
Yeah, as you stated, and it was discussed before, you must always have some base load. And for our strategy, currently, for example, last year our consumption was around 54 BCM. So just 1% was produced within the country. But we know that we have some reserves around the country, and in the country we are investing in the drilling, and we are inviting both international companies and again local companies to discover those opportunities, because this is a requirement for emerging markets like us. Of course, in the longer run, we have a plan to, this is a diversification strategy, first of all, to utilize the local resources. And also in the long run, we have to make sure that we are able to transform this base load as well. So hydrogen could be one of them. I mean, right. Both for the industrial usage, to blend it or mix it within the national gas grid. So it is an important technology, let's say, in the long run. And again, having nuclears would be, important to provide this base load to substitute natural gas power plants. And lastly, as it was mentioned, the storage, battery storage is important to utilize the renewables in the best capacity. But for currently, we will continue investing in those natural gas projects.
Right. And sorry, also before I jump around again, how are multilateral development banks important for countries like Turkey? How do the
we love them.
ADBs?
They are one of the best stakeholders in this regards, and especially for Turkey, European EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or EIF, and IFC, and ADB and Islamic Development Bank. These are the well-known multilateral development bank in Turkey. They are crucial, especially in the early stages, because they pave the road for many other financial institutions. And they are crucial in this regards. First of all, they become equity partners of those energy companies. They provide financing for the projects, the energy projects, and we know them. All of them provided both equity and loans to Turkey. And thirdly, they are enabler of this industrial transformation through their green financing alternatives. And again, they are very crucial to bring these global expertise, technical expertise, know-how from other countries, or their operations in other countries. We value them. We have been working with them on different projects, and we continue these relations, and we are thankful for their contribution in this regard.
Is there, and I know he's sitting right here, but is there anything that they could improve at? Is there anything that you think that needs to be done to help with these institutions unlocking more financing opportunities?
Yeah, there is always room for improvement, but long discussion on that. But I think for countries like us, improving relations with those multilateral development banks is relationship management is the most important thing, because they have the mandate, they have the will, so the countries can utilize it.
Thank you. Sorry, Jackie, just coming back to you, and I just want to talk about JETP very briefly one more time. I'm sorry.
Sure.
You look at South Africa and the JETP program that has been done there. I think it hasn't lived up to what the expectations were. It's the first of its kind. There are going to be obviously hurdles, right? What can you do to make sure JETP works in Southeast Asia? What steps can you take?
Yeah, no, thanks. And so I've got a little phrase which I'm going to patent, which I call the Goldilocks Theory.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm sure everyone, when they were kids, knew the story of Goldilocks. But what you have to do is, especially in Asia, is you have to pick the right coal-fired power plants to phase out. Right? Like in Goldilocks, if you pick a coal-fired power plant that's got 1 year left to go, it's too cold. You're not really going to get much of an impact on carbon emissions. If you pick a coal-fired power plant that's just been constructed, it's too hot. That shareholder is going to they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars. They're not going to want to close it down. They just finished building it. So just like in Goldilocks, you've just got to pick the coal-fired power plants that are just right, room temperature. So they've got 10 years of operating history, but the problem is they've got another 20 to 25 to 30 years left. And that's where you get your bang for your buck, right? That's where you have to work with state-owned utilities and private sector sponsors to try and find a way to persuade them that, look, you know what? Do the right thing. We'll work on this energy transition mechanism to try and get you the same return. Otherwise, why will they close it down? To reduce your asset life.
Right.
That's really the key to getting this done properly. So, I mean, fantastic question. But we've done feasibility studies in Indonesia, where we're piloting in Vietnam, Philippines. We're now looking at places like Kazakhstan and India as well. But again, I also feel that too many people are talking about this. What you really need to do is get one of these transactions actually done.
Right.
Once you get it done, then the second and the third one, become, I won't say easier, but then, you've got a model to follow. The issue at the moment is that we haven't got the first one done. So
what's holding it up?
Lots of things. It's trying to persuade everybody to shut down something earlier than what you invested in. Sure. is not easy. Persuading you to leave your home before your lease expires is not easy. So So it's just making sure that everyone's interests are aligned and just making sure that at the end of the day, everyone gets a fair deal. So that's what we're hoping to do.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And Sylvia, throwing this to you, you look at JETP, you look at these kinds of programs. What's your view? What's Amundi's view on how these can get done and how these systems can improve?
Yeah. So I think what you really shared is for coal is definitely a big problem for Asia. We're heavily dependent over the past few years on our economic developments, and how do we phase that out in terms of project selection is one thing, but I think really have to know for international investor what's the end goal. We're really looking at phase out of coal-fired power plants by 2040, and that's really the deadline that we're looking at. So anything beyond, we feel there's really a heightened risk of stranded asset because it's really prolonged that risk in terms of running the operations of a fossil fuel. The other thing I want to highlight is probably when it comes to coal, there's definitely a lot of consultations on managed coal phase out. Feel free to submit your feedback. But you can see quite clearly there's also different views. So there's a few consultations out there. People are looking at also slightly differently. And we're really at a crossroad when it comes to energy transition. So if you see energy transition finance, I would say if just within the capital markets, SLB was really popular. This year has been really quiet, was really behind because people are really caring about that greenwashing risk. So how do we bring that credibility? And I think to tackle that question is to really focus on transparency. I know it's been talked about, throughout the summit today or for the past really a long time about transparency. But I think we really need to do a lot more in terms of, not just getting that data, but how do we get that data verified? And is it a trusted data when it comes to, in terms of your trajectory, in terms of your emission reductions? That really has to be the central of a success energy transition or even a coal project managed phase though.
And I want to throw that to you, Burak. How does Turkey try to increase transparency, and how do they keep the stakeholders up to the standards that you think that they need to be at?
For the ESG practices?
Yeah, for ESG practices as well.
So, currently, we have regulation on that, first of all. Currently, it's not a very tight one. I mean, ESG reporting and etc., these are based on currently volunteer efforts. But because of the push of the financial markets and, all the companies are, would like to reach out to green financing, so they are doing it by themselves, especially the corporate structures. And our capital markets issued a guideline in 2020, and our public auditing, standard organization is responsible for releasing a national standard. It will be happening in a few quarters, hopefully. And maybe more importantly, for example, Istanbul Stock Exchange, we have Sustainability Index and Sustainability 25 Index. And we had an agreement with Refinitiv. I think this is a good example of, having a trusted and transparent partner. So Refinitiv is running the analysis to make the index, and international investors are able to invest in that index, or the local investors. So having a strategy, and you cannot do it overnight. You must have a kind of gradual plan for such transitions. So we are at the beginning of this gradual plan. So it is currently loose, but of course throughout time it will be tightened. And we agree with the transparency and having a kind of communication with all stakeholders.
Thank you. I think I've got time for one more question. I'm very actually curious about the transparency. Real quick, Sylvia, I want to just go back to you. Are there any steps that companies and governments, people can take today to increase the transparency and to build trust within this sector?
Yeah, definitely. I think pretty much in the world, we have ISSB, of course, locally, or different regions are looking at it from their own lens, whether they wanted to mandatory or promote that. But I think the promotion of that transparency is definitely a key step in terms of having more standardized. What are we talking about in terms of transparency? What do we need within the ESG disclosures? So I think that's definitely a good step forward. But again, a previous panel talked about GRI, TCFD now is in ISSB right now, and a lot of time when it comes to impact. So a lot of time we talk about impact of an investment, of energy transitions. How do we quantify that? I mean, it's energy sort of transition risk, fiscal risk. what's the exposure, that's one thing, but when it comes to the impact of investments, that's also a separate measures that we have to quantify. And a lot of time, not just the primary metrics, but we're also looking at secondary metrics. For example, CO2 avoided in terms of carbon emission data, and how do we harmonize that even in terms of methodology? A lot of time we refer to, the GHG protocols, and also different companies are doing different assumptions. So that is not harmonized definitely in a lot of ways. So we need that in terms of benchmarkings, a better benchmarking. I think that would be really beneficial for the investor.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts. I think we're out of time. I just want to thank again Burak, Sylvia, and Jackie here for letting me ask them a whole bunch of questions. And thank you everyone who came here to listen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.